The slap was so violent it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked right out of the dining room. A heartbeat earlier, the air had been thick with the scent of roasted turkey, rosemary, and the familiar, forced laughter of a family Thanksgiving. A heartbeat later, the world tilted. My sister's palm had connected with my cheek with such velocity that my head snapped to the side, a sharp ring erupting in my ears. The silver fork I'd been holding slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the fine china plate with a sound like a gunshot in the sudden, suffocating silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The flickering candlelight reflected in the wide, stunned eyes of my relatives, but the shock didn't last. My father's face transformed, turning a mottled, bruised purple. He didn't look at Rachel, whose hand was still trembling from the impact of the strike. He looked at me. He stood up, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor, and pointed a trembling finger toward the front door. "Get out." I slowly straightened my neck, the skin on my face beginning to throb and burn. I looked at him, searching for a shred of the protector he used to be when I was a child. I found nothing but a stranger's malice. "You heard me," he snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous guttural low. "Get out of my house, Emily. Take your attitude and your uniform and get out. And don't you ever think about coming back." I looked at my mother. She was staring intently at her plate, obsessively smoothing a napkin that didn't need smoothing. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Then I looked at Rachel. A slow, poisonous smirk spread across her lips, the look of a victor who had finally driven the enemy from the field. Outside, a bitter November wind was whipping snow across the driveway in ghostly sheets. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing while we were eating. I stood there for a long moment, the sting on my cheek a cold reminder of where I stood in this hierarchy. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply nodded once, a sharp military motion. I picked up my heavy wool coat, draped it over my arm, and walked out into the biting dark. By sunrise the next morning, the world they thought they knew would be gone. My father would realize he no longer had a roof over his head. My mother would lose the keys to the life she took for granted. And Rachel, my spirited older sister, would discover that the safety net she'd spent 30 years shredding was officially gone. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Carter family was about to learn a truth they should have mastered a long time ago. Everything they thought belonged to them actually belonged to me. My name is Emily Carter. This is the story of how my family threw me out on Thanksgiving night, and why they woke up the next morning with absolutely nothing. In the mythology of the Carter family, I was the invisible daughter. Every family has one, the child who functions as the load-bearing wall. While others are the decorative molding or the bright windows, the load-bearing wall quietly holds up the entire structure. It doesn't ask for praise, and because it's so reliable, people eventually forget it's there at all. I was the one who solved the impossible problems. I was the one who quietly rerouted funds when the bank accounts ran dry. I was the one who sacrificed my youth, my holidays, and my comfort, so they could maintain the illusion of a perfect suburban life. Rachel was my polar opposite. She was the sun around which my parents orbited. Growing up, she was spirited. As an adult, everyone else called her what she truly was: spoiled, entitled, and destructive. If Rachel crashed a car, my parents apologized to her for the stress of the accident. If Rachel lost a job, it was because the boss was intimidated by her. I enlisted in the army at 20. Initially, it was a desperate search for a purpose that didn't involve cleaning up Rachel's messes. But I stayed because I found a world that made sense. A world where respect was earned, not inherited, and where actions had clear, unyielding consequences. Over 18 years, I climbed the ranks through sheer grinding competence. I spent birthdays in mud-cake tents in the Middle East. I spent Christmases on humid flight lines in the Pacific. I missed weddings, funerals, and reunions. While Rachel was drifting from one artistic endeavor to another, failing at everything and borrowing money she never intended to repay, I was becoming a leader of soldiers. Everything I had, I earned in blood, sweat, and discipline. 15 years ago, my father made a disastrous investment, a sure thing that turned out to be a classic Ponzi scheme. They were weeks away from a sheriff's sale. The neighbors, the church friends, the relatives, they all thought my parents had miraculously recovered. The miracle was me. I stepped in and bought the house outright. I didn't do it for the power. I did it because I didn't want my mother on the street. Every legal document, every mortgage payment, every cent of property tax, and every insurance premium for the last decade and a half had come from my military salary. I paid for the new roof. I paid for the furnace when it died in the dead of winter. I paid for the plumbing repairs that kept the lights on and the water running. But I never made a grand announcement. I simply handed them the keys and told them to live their lives. I did the same with their cars. 2 vehicles, both titled in my name, both insured by my policies. Normalcy is a dangerous thing. When you give people a gift for long enough, they stop seeing it as a kindness. They start seeing it as a right. By that Thanksgiving dinner, my family had completely erased the fact that they were living on my dime. The dinner had started with a deceptive warmth. I had driven 3 hours from Fort Liberty, exhausted but hopeful. For 30 minutes we were a normal family. Then Rachel grew bored. She thrived on friction. She brought up a friend's recent engagement, then pivoted toward me with that sharp, predatory glint in her eyes. "So Emily," she said, swirling her wine. "Still single? Still playing soldier in the dirt?" I shrugged, trying to keep the peace. "Still happy, Rachel. That's what matters, right?" A few cousins chuckled. Rachel's smile curdled. "You know," she said, her voice rising so the whole table could hear. "At some point being happy is just an excuse for being unlovable. Do you think any man wants a woman who spends her life giving orders and wearing boots? You've forgotten how to be a woman, Emily. You're just a machine." The table went silent. I kept my voice level, the way I would with a subordinate who was losing their cool. "I've been a soldier for 18 years, Rachel. It's not an act. It's who I am." My father let out a dry, mocking chuckle. "Exactly. Maybe if you weren't so busy being Major Carter, you'd realize why nobody wants to be around you for more than an hour." I didn't take the bait. I reached for my water glass. My lack of a reaction infuriated Rachel. She needed me to scream. She needed me to break. "You think you're so much better than us," she hissed, leaning across the table. "With your service and your rank. You're nothing but a cold, arrogant bitch who thinks she owns the world." "I don't," I said simply. "I just live in the real world." That was the unforgivable truth. Rachel surged to her feet, her chair flying back. The slap happened before I could even blink. The aftermath was a blur of coldness. After my father told me to never come back, I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time. I wasn't crying. I was just finished. The bridge wasn't just burned. It had been nuked. I pulled out my laptop, tethered it to my phone, and logged into a secure legal folder. I stared at the property deeds. I stared at the vehicle titles. I stared at the power of attorney documents. I called my attorney, David. He answered on the second ring despite the holiday. "Emily? Is everything okay?" I looked at the house, the warm yellow light glowing behind the curtains where they were likely laughing about how they'd finally put me in my place. "David," I said, my voice as cold as the snow on my windshield. "It's time. Execute everything. The house, the cars, the accounts. I want it all closed by Monday morning." There was a long pause. David knew the history. He knew the sacrifices. "Are you absolutely certain, Emily? Once we file the termination of occupancy and the repossession orders, there's no going back." I thought of the sting on my cheek. I thought of my mother's silent betrayal. I thought of 18 years of being the invisible foundation. I'm not changing my mind. If I'm not welcome in that house, then neither are they. The next morning was gray and brutal. I woke up in a motel with a strange sense of clarity. For years, I had been holding on to the hope that they would love me for what I did. Now, I realized I didn't want to be loved for my utility. I wanted to be respected for my humanity. The documents began flying via email at 8 a.m. My father called me 15 minutes later. I was in a small diner, staring into a cup of black coffee when his name flashed on the screen. "What the hell is this?" he screamed the moment I picked up. "No hello. No, I'm sorry for last night. Just pure unadulterated rage." "You'll have to be more specific, Dad," I said, stirring my coffee. "The notice. Some legal firm sent an email saying our occupancy agreement has been terminated. It says we have 30 days to vacate or face formal eviction. Have you lost your mind?" "I haven't," I replied. "I'm just following your orders. You told me to get out of your house. I checked the deed this morning. It's not your house. It's mine. I bought it 15 years ago to keep you from the street. If you want me out, then I'm out. But I'm taking my assets with me." The silence on the other end was heavy, punctuated only by his ragged breathing. "You can't do this," he whispered, the rage replaced by a sudden sharp edge of panic. "This is our home." "No," I said. "It's my property. You were guests who overstayed your welcome and assaulted the owner. That's a bad combination, Dad. You're overreacting. It was one argument. We were all stressed." "It wasn't one argument. It was 18 years of being your ATM and your punching bag. You told me never to come back. I'm just making sure I don't have a reason to." I hung up before he could respond. By noon, the invisible daughter was the only thing anyone could talk about. Rachel called 5 times. I blocked her. Then the texts started from various relatives. Asterisk, "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? Don't be so dramatic, Emily." It was fascinating. The woman who slapped me was calling me dramatic for reclaiming my own home. Then my mother called. Her voice was small, trembling. "Emily, your father says the cars. A tow truck is here for the SUV." "That's right, Mom. The lease agreement I had with you both is over. I'm selling the vehicles. I'm sure Rachel can drive you where you need to go. We don't have anything else, Emily. Why didn't you tell us you owned it all?" "I did tell you, Mom. Every time a tax bill came. Every time the insurance needed a signature. You just didn't want to hear it because knowing the truth would mean you'd have to be grateful. And gratitude is a very heavy burden for this family." The week that followed was a slow-motion car crash. My father's SUV was towed while the neighbors watched from behind their curtains. My mother's sedan disappeared the next day. The most satisfying and painful moment came when Aunt Linda called. She was the family's self-appointed moral compass. "Emily, dear, don't you think you've made your point? Your father is under so much stress. Surely we can find a way to forgive and move on?" "Stress, Linda? I've spent 18 years in the army. I know what stress is. Stress is wondering if your family will still be there when you come home from a deployment. I found out they weren't. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a benefactor. They can't have one without the other anymore." The final confrontation happened on Saturday. Rachel showed up at my house unannounced. She didn't look like the smug victor from Thanksgiving. Her hair was unwashed, her eyes were puffy, and the expensive designer coat I'd probably indirectly paid for was rumpled. She pushed her way into my living room the moment I opened the door. "You've completely lost it," she shouted. "Mom is crying constantly, Dad is looking at studio apartments he can't afford, and you're just sitting here? Over a slap?" I folded my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "So what?" I said, repeating the words she'd muttered to our cousin earlier that week. "What? You told everyone, so what? When they asked about you hitting me. So I'm saying it now. You're losing your lifestyle? So what? You have to get a real job to pay rent? So what?" Rachel's face twisted. For the first time I saw real naked fear in her eyes. The safety net hadn't just been pulled away, it had been incinerated. "I can't afford my life, Emily. The emergency account." David said I'm blocked. I smiled, though it didn't reach my eyes. "The emergency account was for medical bills and house repairs. You've been using it for vacations and shoes for 3 years. I let it slide because I wanted peace. But peace is expensive, Rachel. And I'm no longer willing to pay for it." She stared at me, realizing that the sister she had bullied, ignored, and mocked was gone. In her place was a woman who had commanded hundreds of soldiers, who had survived war zones, and who was no longer afraid of a little silence at the dinner table. "I'm done rescuing people who wouldn't even offer me a hand when I was down," I said quietly. "You wanted me to leave. I left. Now you get to see what life looks like without the wall holding you up." As I closed the door on her, I realized that for the first time in nearly 20 years, I wasn't an invisible daughter. I was finally completely visible to myself. Legally, appropriately, and immediately, I repeated, the words tasting like iron. "You closed it?" "Yes," I said, my voice unwavering. Rachel sank into a chair, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp hiss. It was as if the bones in her legs had turned to glass, unable to bear the sudden crushing weight of her own life. For the first time in my existence, I didn't see a performance. There was no calculated pouting. No manipulative tears designed to make me feel guilty. This was genuine raw panic. She was finally staring adulthood in the face. A cold, indifferent mirror. There was no backup plan, no safety net, and no Emily to catch her. There was only the silence of the room and the consequences of her own actions. She looked up at me, and for a fleeting second, I thought the sheer pressure might force an apology from her lips. Instead, she whispered, "What am I supposed to do now?" The answer was so simple it felt like an insult. "Work," I replied. Her eyes welled up and then she broke. It wasn't a graceful cinematic cry. It was a violent, full-body sob, the sound of years of parasitic dependence crashing into the jagged rocks of reality. I stood there and watched her. I didn't do it out of cruelty but out of a new kind of acceptance. Some lessons cannot be taught through kindness or lectures. They have to be lived in the cold. Eventually, she gathered what was left of her dignity and left. The heavy thud of the front door echoed through the hallway, and for the first time in years the house breathed. That night I sat alone on my back porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the snow drift across the yard like a white shroud. The air was biting, and the stars were unnaturally bright. In the stillness I felt a sensation so unfamiliar, I almost didn't recognize it. Peace. Then the vibration of my phone shattered the quiet. A text message from my mother. Just 4 words. *, we need to talk. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. There was something different about the cadence of those words. They weren't demanding. They weren't defensive or cloaked in the usual passive-aggressive manipulation. They just felt tired. Bone-deep tired. I knew then that the illusion had finally collapsed. My mother wasn't reaching out because she wanted a check or a favor. She was reaching out because the walls had finally fallen. I didn't reply immediately. It wasn't about punishment or making her worry. I simply needed time to exist in a world where I didn't have to react to their every whim. For 20 years our family followed a predictable toxic cycle. Someone hurt me, I absorbed the blow, I fixed the problem, and then we all pretended it never happened. We called it normal. But I realized now that normal was just another word for tolerated abuse. I waited nearly 24 hours before I sent a 3-word response. * when and where? Her reply was instantaneous. * tomorrow noon, Maple Grove Cafe. Just us. I didn't believe the just us part for a second. As it turned out, my intuition was as sharp as ever. The Maple Grove Cafe sat on the edge of town, overlooking a frozen pond. It was the kind of place older couples frequented, warm lighting, the scent of cinnamon and expensive coffee, and a quiet atmosphere that made family arguments feel like a sacrilege. But the moment I stepped inside, I saw the firing squad waiting. All 3 of them. My mother, my father, and Rachel. I paused at the entrance not out of surprise, but out of a weary sense of course. My father sat rigidly, his arms crossed over his chest like a fortress. Rachel looked hollowed out, her eyes red-rimmed. My mother looked a decade older than she had 2 weeks ago. The emotional toll of the truth had finally begun to etch itself into her face. I approached the table in silence. I sat down. The silence stretched thin, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons and the low hum of the espresso machine. It lasted until the waitress took our drink orders and disappeared. Only then did my father break. "You tricked us," he spat. I almost laughed. It wasn't funny, but it was so pathetically predictable. He had managed to transform himself back into the victim in record time. "No," I said calmly. His jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. "You hid everything from us. You let us believe things that weren't true." "I didn't hide anything," I countered, leaning forward. "You just never bothered to look. You never asked." Before he could retort, I opened the leather folder I had brought. I placed it on the table like a judge delivering a sentence. Inside was a thick stack of documents, the physical evidence of 20 years of silence. Opinions can be debated, but facts are stubborn things. I slid the first page across the wood. The property deed. My name, Emily Carter, was printed clearly at the top as the sole owner. Rachel stared at it as if it were written in a foreign language. My mother's breath hitched. My father looked away, refusing to acknowledge the ink. I placed more documents down one by one like cards in a high-stakes game. Property tax records spanning 15 years. Every payment. Every receipt. Every cent, insurance records, mortgage history, invoices for the $22,000 roof, the $9,000 furnace, the $16,000 foundation repair. The pile grew higher. The silence grew heavier. Finally, my mother reached out, her hands trembling as she picked up a page. "These are all yours?" she whispered. "Yes," I said. She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she saw the sheer volume of the numbers. She wasn't hearing vague estimates anymore. She was seeing the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had poured into a black hole while they treated me like an inconvenience. My father shifted uncomfortably. Rachel looked stunned, her mouth slightly agape. In that moment, I understood the core of their denial. They hadn't wanted to know the truth because knowing would have required gratitude. Knowing would have required responsibility. It was much easier to live in the dark and pretend the light just happened by itself. "Emily," my mother began, her voice cracking. I cut her off before she could find an excuse. "Do you know what the hardest part is? It's not the money. I don't care about the money." That caught them off guard. Rachel blinked in confusion. My father frowned. "The money was never the point," I continued, my voice low and steady. "The hardest part is that none of you ever cared enough to ask how I was doing it. You never cared enough to ask if I was okay." The words sat on the table, unavoidable and heavy. For years I had hidden behind my military discipline: work harder, stay calm, move forward. But there was nowhere left to hide now. "Rachel, do you know how many birthdays I spent in a tent overseas, so I could send you extra money?" She looked down at her hands. "Mom, do you know how many holidays I missed because I couldn't afford the flight and the house repairs you said were emergencies?" Tears began to leak from her eyes. "Dad, do you know how many times I went without so you could keep up appearances?" He remained silent. His silence was the loudest answer of all. They didn't know because they never considered me a person. I was a utility, a source of revenue. My mother's shoulders began to shake. She started to cry. Not the manipulative wail of Rachel, but a quiet, shattering sob. She rarely cried in public, but the weight of 20 years of reality was finally crushing her. "I didn't know," she choked out. I didn't know. I had spent years imagining how satisfying those words would feel. But as I heard them, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt a profound, aching sadness. She was telling the truth. She didn't know because she had willfully blinded herself. Rachel was staring at a specific set of documents she had pulled from the folder. Her face went pale, the blood draining from her cheeks until she looked like a ghost. She had found the college tuition payments. Every semester, every transfer, every grant our parents supposedly got her. It was all me. She flipped further. Her first apartment deposit. My name. A credit card debt settlement. My name. Emergency medical bills. My name. I thought Mom and Dad paid for this," she whispered, her voice sounding small and childlike. "They couldn't," I said, meeting her gaze. "They never had the money, Rachel. You were living a life I paid for while you told me I didn't belong in the family." The realization hit her like a physical blow. The arrogance she had worn like a suit of armor for years crumbled in seconds. For the first time in her life, she wasn't angry. She was ashamed. We all turned to my father. He was the last holdout, the one person who hadn't broken. He sat motionless, his pride wrapped around him like rusted chainmail. When he finally spoke, he chose the coward's path. "You still shouldn't have done this," he said, his voice cold. The words fell like lead. My mother closed her eyes in shame. Rachel looked horrified. Even the waitress, passing by with a tray of drinks, flinched at the tone. "After all of this?" I asked, gesturing to the mountain of evidence. "After the truth? That's your response?" He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't say thank you. He said I was wrong for exposing the lie. In that moment, I realized my father wasn't refusing to apologize because he hated me. He was refusing because an apology would destroy the fragile, false image of the provider he had built for himself. Some people would rather drown in their own pride than admit they were rescued by someone they disrespected. He stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair screeching against the floor. "I'm leaving." Nobody stopped him. Not even my mother. We watched him walk toward the door, the small bell jingling softly as he disappeared into the cold afternoon air. Just like that, he was gone. The three of us sat in the vacuum he left behind. Finally, Rachel looked up. The arrogance was gone. The sister I had known for years was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. "I didn't know," she whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I'm so sorry, Emily." The words were late and they didn't fix the past, but for the first time they sounded honest. I believed her. My mother reached across the table, her hand hovering tentatively before she touched mine. "I'm sorry too. For everything." I looked out the window at the snow drifting over the frozen pond. Something inside me, a knot I had carried since I was a teenager, finally loosened. It wasn't full forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. The months that followed were a quiet revelation. Winter settled over North Carolina, and as the snow melted into spring, life began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. For years, I believed that if I stopped carrying my family, they would perish. I thought the world would end if I wasn't the one holding up the sky. But I was wrong. The world kept turning. People adapted. Rachel found a job. A real full-time 40-hour-a-week job. Not a passion project or a temporary gig, but actual labor. She called me one evening, her voice sounding exhausted but different. "I started on Monday," she said. "How is it?" I asked. "My feet hurt," she groaned, and then she laughed. "I should have done this years ago, Emily. I really should have. Some people grow in the sun, but others only grow when they're forced to find their own light." My mother changed too. She stopped retreating into silence. She started calling just to talk. No hidden agendas, no requests for money. We were learning how to be mother and daughter without the shadow of debt hanging over us. She told me once, "I spent so many years keeping the peace that I forgot peace and silence aren't the same thing." My parents moved into a small, affordable rental. They were finally living within their means, not mine. And they survived. They didn't collapse, they just adjusted. But my father remained the exception. He doubled down on his bitterness. He blamed lawyers, he blamed the system. He blamed me. I stopped expecting him to change, and strangely, that brought me the most peace of all. Not everyone gets a redemption arc. Some people choose their pride over their children, and you have to learn to be okay with that. Then for months after that Thanksgiving night, a pickup truck pulled into my driveway. I was in the backyard, tending to the first blooms of spring. I watched as my father stepped out of the truck. He looked smaller, his shoulders slumped, the fire of his anger dampened by the reality of his new life. He approached me slowly, the silence between us feeling like a vast canyon. I waited. I didn't help him. He looked away, then back at me, his voice barely a whisper. "I owe you an apology." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. "I was wrong," he said. For simple words. They carried more weight than any bank statement or deed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't rewriting history or blaming the world. He was standing in the truth. I saw the regret in his eyes, the deep realization that the house and the cars weren't the things he had lost. He had nearly lost his daughter. "I should have protected you that night," he choked out. I felt a surge of grief, not for the money, but for the years of missed connection. "You should have," I agreed softly. He nodded, a single tear escaping. "I failed you." In that moment the war was over. Not because everything was perfect, but because the truth finally stood between us, naked and undeniable. I stepped forward and hugged him. I didn't do it because the past was gone, but because carrying hatred is its own kind of prison, and I was ready to be free. As he drove away, I realized that people often think this story is about revenge. It isn't. Revenge is about causing pain. This was about boundaries. It was about the moment I stopped allowing people to benefit from my sacrifices while they stomped on my heart. I learned that boundaries aren't cruel. Self-respect isn't selfishness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is to let the consequences do the teaching that your kindness never could. That Thanksgiving, they threw me out of a house they thought was theirs. By sunrise, I had reclaimed what was mine. And in doing so, I gave us all the only thing that could ever save us: the truth.